Hey, I'm Dan from RB Leaguers, and today we're talking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and not just talking about it, ranking it. More than even some of the most expansive franchises, the MCU encompasses 20 films, with 3 more coming out this year. That's 23 total. That's more like a TV series, an entire season where you've got some better episodes, some worse episodes, and some that are really integral to the plot. And with so many films, what I'm going to do is split this into 2 videos. This first video will cover the bottom 10 films. That's number 20 through 11. And I'll follow up with my top 10 later. I'm going to discuss each film in this video individually, but I don't want to keep you hanging, so I'm going to put my list right up front. In dead last at number 20, I've got The Incredible Hulk, a movie that Kevin Feige pretends never happened, and probably for good reason. It's not interesting, it has a boring villain, and it really feels like one of those episodes early on in a TV series where it's not sure what it's doing yet, and it pretty much does not matter at all to the rest of the MCU. Number 19 is Thor: The Dark World. The sequel to the first installment of this trilogy does not manage to improve on the first at all. We again have Jane Foster portrayed by Natalie Portman and Chris Hemsworth's Thor, who have no chemistry whatsoever. The conflict is uninteresting and does not matter because the villain is boring, underdeveloped, and generic, with motivations including wanting power and conquest. And even though we get another great performance from Tom Hiddleston as Loki, it's not enough to rescue Thor: The Dark World from being one of the MCU's darkest entries. Number 18 is Thor. Thor's introduction to the MCU ranks just higher than its sequel because it at least accomplishes some of the world building it sets out to do, and it pits Thor against his brother Loki and his ambitions. Still, main problem with this film is that even though it's introducing the God of Thunder and Asgard, it feels pretty small because a lot of its action set pieces take place in a small town that feels like it belongs on a small budget TV studio rather than a big blockbuster movie. And the direction of the film feels pretty heavy-handed, with a lot of the shots being diagonal. It makes the audience feel a little dizzy. And on top of that, we've got the dyed eyebrows. A really unforgivable transgression.
Who are you?
An old man and a fool!
That's hurtful.
At number 17, I've got Iron Man 2. I know that Tony Stark and Iron Man are the anchors of the MCU, but Iron Man's standalone movies after the first have been far from compelling. Iron Man 2 delivers one of Tony's most iconic suit-up scenes. The suitcase suit-up scene on the racetrack was awesome. But otherwise, there's not much to get excited about. You've got a ridiculous villain in Vanko, aka Whiplash, who literally shows up shirtless with electric whips and somehow isn't immediately killed. Later, he obsesses over a bird for a good part of the film. And then there's Hammer of Hammer Tech, a supposed competitor to Stark Industries, but never really feels legitimate or like true competition, mostly there for comedic relief. So the stakes never feel real throughout this entire film. And even with Robert Downey Jr.'s perfect portrayal of Tony Stark, the film falls short.
I want my bird. My bird. I want my bird.
This is not my bird.
This is not my bird.
At number 16, I've got Iron Man 3. This movie is pretty underwhelming. It suffers from a lot of the same problems as Iron Man 2. You've got a very bizarre twist with the Mandarin, one of the iconic Iron Man villains, who turns out to be a British actor. The real Mandarin turns out to be Guy Pearce, which is not an interesting reveal. That villain's motivation is very silly. He was just offended by Tony one time at a party, and in the end, Tony Stark ends up destroying all his suits, which I think is supposed to be a dramatic turn of events, but everything's just kind of undercut by the absurdity of the extremist plotline and the way they executed it. Pepper Potts at the end getting superpowers and defeating the Mandarin, quote unquote. The only real mitigating factor that this movie has is the fact that Tony is dealing with PTSD, anxiety issues from the events of Avengers, which actually are an interesting part of his story arc. So you see his character develop a bit there. But otherwise, the movie, which had a lot of setup and anticipation, fell flat.
My name's Trevor.
Travis Slattery. Don't hurt the face, I'm an actor.
At number 15, I've got Doctor Strange, which may be a surprising choice. I know a lot of people, especially critics, love this movie, and I think it does succeed in introducing magic to the MCU and a new character, but it does so with a pretty predictable storyline, especially in the first half. I mean, we've seen the arrogant rich guy learns his lesson before. We've seen the arrogant persona before, we've seen the facial hair before in Tony Stark, but Cumberbatch's Strange is a lot less charming. We really don't get the differences until we see them together in Infinity War, which comes much later. The movie is also diminished by its controversial whitewashing of the Ancient One, which would have been one of the few Asian characters in the MCU. The best parts of the film are the stunning visuals and the creative way time is used to defeat the big bad, but it's not enough to overcome the weaknesses.
Dreams collapsing.
At number 14, I've got Ant-Man and the Wasp. The sequel to the first Ant-Man brings back fun and adventure and a lighthearted feel to the MCU, which audiences sorely needed after that depressing Infinity War ending. We finally get to see Hope don the Wasp suit, which was awesome, and we waited for throughout the entire first film and never got. And we get that great comedy from Rudd and, of course, Michael Pena, who is just an absolute legend in this role. But ultimately, I think the film underuses and underdevelops its villain, and by the end, it feels almost like the writers just knew that they needed Scott to end up in the quantum realm and sort of reverse engineered it from there with the Janet Van Dyne plot. So while I enjoyed this movie and it was a great ride, ultimately, it will fall into this middle range of films in the MCU.
I was partners with him. How big did you get?
At number 13, I've got Captain America, the First Avenger. Marvel's debut of one of its most iconic heroes manages to provide us with a solid understanding of what makes Captain America tick. It's not just the super soldier serum that makes him a hero, but his core values and compassion. The film also features an iconic villain in the Red Skull, one of Cap's arch rivals, but it fails to pack the punch you'd expect pitting Cap against the Red Skull. This movie also features a somewhat nonsensical use of Cap for a while, with him being on stage selling war bonds that doesn't really entertain the audience or make much sense. By the end, though, we're left with a film that is worth revisiting, especially if you want to understand the character's motivations and his backstory, but it's ultimately overshadowed by the more compelling stories to come.
Wait!
I could do this all day.
Go get him.
At number 12, I've got Ant-Man. Ant-Man managed to overcome production issues, namely a switch in the director, to introduce one of Marvel's lesser-known heroes in a new, innovative, and exciting way, a heist movie. It also gives us the ant's eye view with amazing visuals, taking the audience along for the ride throughout the film, and it delivers a good mix of action with comedy even during its climactic battle to keep the audience interested throughout. I mean, who doesn't like Giant Thomas the Tank Engine? And Paul Rudd and Michael Pena are hilarious. This film ranks above its sequel because it's more original, and the second is at its best when it's most like this one. This film, along with Guardians, which came out the prior year, showed that Marvel was able to make successful films with even some of its lesser-known heroes.
You want to show me how to punch? Show me how to punch.
Wasn't my idea.
At number 11, I've got Avengers: Age of Ultron. After the success of the first Avengers film, the hype around this follow-up was out of this world. And it was a bit of a letdown for audiences when this one felt less cohesive and compelling than the first. It definitely suffered from setup syndrome, with several scenes feeling jammed into the narrative merely to plug Infinity War. Especially that Thor in a hot tub scene. Still, it did manage to deliver thrilling action from the very get-go, introduce several new characters without losing sight of the main players, and develop characters and relationships important to the understanding of the story, like Cap and Tony's philosophical disagreements, Natasha's past, Hawkeye's secret family. But all that's not enough to overcome the feeling that Age of Ultron underdelivered on its own title, with a villain who failed to achieve almost any part of his weird plan to drop Sokovia like a meteor, and feels drastically underutilized as a super intelligent AI. So, ultimately, Ultron will be the one Avengers film that falls outside of my top 10.
This is exactly what I wanted. All of you against all of me.
I give you all of me. and you give me.
So there you have it. Those are my bottom 10 MCU films. This was quite a difficult task for me as I love the MCU. But what do you think? This is just my opinion. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Did I put some of your favorites in the bottom 10? Or do you think I did a pretty good job? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for my top 10 list where it only gets harder because the movies only get better.